Last week, we started a 5-week sermon series on the book of James. I suspect the first thing that many of us noticed is that James spends little time buttering us up. No, he gets right to the point, in no uncertain terms, that unless we are reaching out to the poor, the orphan, and the widow, then our spirituality, our faith, our relationship with God, it means nothing. James shoots straight. And I don't know about you, but especially today, the text that Emily read for us, when she said the word of the Lord, I found it a little hard to respond, thanks be to God, because this is hard. James sets the bar high. Today's week 2, and no, James is not letting up, sorry. Today, his concern is with church folk treating other people differently on the basis of what they look like, how they're dressed, how much money we think they have. I read last week about a meeting that took place in the 1880s. There was a lady, it appears, in a faded cotton gingham dress, and her husband, dressed in a homespun, rather threadbare suit. Together they stepped off the train in Boston, walked rather timidly, without an appointment, into the office of the president of Harvard University. The secretary met them in that outer portion of the office, and she sized them up in no time. She could tell that these backwoods country folk had no business at Harvard, didn't deserve to be in Cambridge. "We'd like to see the president," the man said softly. He'll be busy all day," the secretary snapped back. To which they responded, "We'll wait." For hours, the secretary ignored them, hoping that the couple would finally become discouraged and go away. Well, that didn't happen. So the secretary grew frustrated and finally decided to disturb the president, even though that was a chore that she often regretted. "Maybe if you'll just see them for a few minutes, sir, they'll leave." He sighed in exasperation and nodded. Someone of his importance did not have the time to spend with those kinds of people. The president, stern-faced, told them, "Come into his office, he has just a minute." They sat down and the lady told him, "Sir, we have a son who attended Harvard for a little while. He loved this place, he was happy here. But about a year ago, he died from illness. My husband and I would like to erect a memorial to him somewhere on campus." The president was not sympathetic. "Madam," he said gruffly, "we cannot put up a statue to every person who has attended Harvard and died. If we did, this place would be a cemetery." "Oh, no," the lady replied quickly. We don't desire to erect a statue. We thought we might like to give a building to Harvard." The president rolled his eyes. He glanced at her cotton dress and the threadbare suit the man was wearing and exclaimed, "A building? Do you have any earthly idea how much a building costs? We have over $7 million in the physical buildings here at Harvard. And in 1880, that was quite a sum." For a few moments, the lady was silent. president was pleased maybe he could get rid of them now. The lady turned to her husband and said, $7 million. Is that all it costs to start a university? Maybe we ought to start our own. Her husband nodded in agreement. All the blood drained from the president's face. The couple got up and walked away, traveling back to Palo Alto, California, where they, Mr. and Mrs. Leland Stanford, established the university that bears their name. Now, to be fair, Harvard University disputes this account. And it seems to be a little more urban legend than truth. But even if there's just a bit of truth, it's a great story. The moral of it is that we ought not judge others or treat them dishonorably based on the way they look. I think James would have something to say about that story. For in today's passage, he is speaking to a group of people whom we'd probably refer to as middle class. They are not rich. No, these folks are trying to curry the favor of the rich. People he's speaking to are not the poor. No, those are the folks that James's hearers are disregarding. These are folks somewhere in between rich and poor. They are like many of us. So these not rich but not poor people are gathering for worship, and they're paying particular attention to the wealthy people among them. Now, James doesn't tell us why they do this, but we can imagine. Maybe they have a business deal that they're trying to close. Maybe they're just rubbing elbows with the rich in an attempt to climb a few rungs on the social ladder. Or maybe they were the church finance committee, I don't know. Maybe they realized that in order to pay the church's bills, they had to have some well-to-do benefactors to help keep the lights on and pay the preacher. And if that's what they were doing, well, that's understandable. Congregations often tend to the wealthy members among them, making sure they and their family members are happy, ensuring that they will maintain their level of giving to the church. Again, understandable, because every congregation needs some folks who are able to help out at a slightly higher rate. So it makes sense, I suppose, to pay them some attention. So maybe James's problem is not with tending to the needs of the wealthy. Maybe his problem is when that is done at the expense of the poor. When our attention to the wealthy becomes favoritism and leads us to neglect others, especially the poor. I was at a retreat a few years ago with a pastor friend of mine, and he told me when we were discussing this passage in preparation to preach it several years ago, he told me that he had just been hired to be the associate pastor at a church in another part of the state. This was several years before. He hadn't yet moved to town, but his wife had gone ahead to look for houses in this community. And that Sunday, my friend's wife went to the church where her husband was to begin his ministry in a few weeks. She was not able to accompany him on the visit weekend, or the trial weekend we might call it, so this was an opportunity to visit the church. She walked in, sat right in the middle. According to my friend, she sang, prayed, worshiped, and then left after the benediction. The only problem was, she said, not a soul spoke to her. A few weeks later, my friend had arrived on staff, and he was leading in worship doing the announcements portion right before, in that church, they have a meet and greet time. And during that meet and greet time, when folks were shaking hands, one of the deacons came right up to him and said, I see that there's a couple here. I understand they just bought a rather large multi-million-dollar home out at the lake. Come on, we need to go introduce ourselves. My friend said not a word and obliged. But afterwards he thought, what would James say to this? This is what James is talking about here, friends. James knows that it is our human tendency to side with the haves, and even if we don't do it consciously, that sometimes causes us to ignore the needs of the have-nots. And for James, in light of the gospel, he says, this just doesn't make logical sense. For he says in verse 5, God has chosen the poor to be rich. I like his use of words here. God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith and heirs to the kingdom. Therefore, according to James, if we want to be good Christians, wouldn't we want to cozy up to those who are rich in faith? People we might learn a thing or two from. But James has to remind us, because that's not how we often behave. James says, why do you dishonor the poor? They are not the ones who are oppressing you. They're not the ones who are hauling you into court. That's the rich. Why are you dishonoring the poor? He just can't understand it. And as much as I'd love to know that things have changed so much since James first penned these words, I'm afraid they haven't. It breaks my heart when I hear our elected leaders and those running for office often chastise the poor for being the source of so much of what is wrong with our nation. They're ruining our country, bleeding us for all we're worth. Really? James might ask. Really? What was it the poor who a few years ago sold subprime mortgages to you? Was it the poor who took those risky bets at banks too big to fail? Why are you chastising them? James says, why are you showing contempt to the poor? They are not the ones oppressing you. Friends, his words could have been written yesterday. Favoritism is dangerous business. And according to James, it puts our faith in jeopardy. For what does James say? With your acts of favoritism, do you really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? As a society, we can do better, and I believe the church can lead the way. We can model a new way for relationship and community building that takes into account James's call, that takes seriously James's call not to demonize the rich, not to demonize the poor. We are called to bridge the gap, to stand in that place between the rich and the poor and proclaim Christ died for us all, no matter who we are. We will soon begin here at River Road Church our emphasis on stewardship, where we will ask you to consider supporting the good ministry that God is doing among us. Yes, our church has responsibilities to meet and bills to pay, but that's not the most important reason we ask you to give. We ask you to give generously because we believe that it's good for you. We believe that it will help you grow in your relationship with God and this church. It will help you trust God and God's grace. And if you're like me, you recognize that God has blessed you with far more than you deserve. And giving generously to this church allows me to return thanks in a very tangible way. But what's more, giving keeps me from hoarding all those blessings to myself. For if I withhold my giving and hoard these blessings for just me, I may begin to resent those who don't have what I have. And that, friends, I believe is what James wants us to be on guard against. Do you know the name Sandor Tetzler? I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. As I read his story last week, it was one of those moments. Have you had these where you say, I'm sort of embarrassed, I don't know who this person is? I learned about him for the first time last week. He was born in Hungary, but immigrated to the United States after escaping a concentration camp during World War II. Trained as a textile worker, he found his way down to Spartanburg, South Carolina. After he made a bit of money, he opened his own factory in 1961 near Kings Mountain, sort of over near the North Carolina border. Kings Mountain, you need to know, was a very difficult place in terms of race relations in the early 60s. Sandor hired 16 new employees to work in his factory, 8 white men and 8 black men. In his small factory, there was 1 bathroom, 1 set of showers, 1 water fountain. After an initial introduction and a tour of the plant for all the new employees, one of the white workers boldly asked, "Is this going to be some kind of integrated plant?" Mr. Tetzler replied, "At my plant, you are being paid twice as much as any other textile worker in this area. You can work with us here in the way we will work, or you can go somewhere else. Are there any other questions?" Of course, there were none. All 16 employees stayed. Several months later, the factory's production had grown such that a new batch of employees needed to be hired. After an initial tour, the same question was raised by one of the new hires. "Is this going to be some kind of integrated plant?" At that time, the foreman, the one who raised the question the first time, replied, "At this plant, you are being paid twice as much as any other textile worker in this area. You can work with us here in the way we will work, or you can work somewhere else. Are there any other questions?" I loved reading that story because it teaches me this. When we get right down to it, church, we realize that we're not all that different one from another. Rich and poor, black, white, brown, young and old. Why do we continue to draw these false lines between us? Because we're all children of God. And before God, these false distinctions, they fade away rather quickly, don't they? James calls us to stand not on one side or another. No, James calls us to stand alongside the cross of Jesus Christ, to bridge the gap between what is now and what will one day be. And according to James, we must not stand anywhere else. Amen.